guys, so welcome back to part 3 of my validation series. So I hope you guys have found it helpful so far. If you haven't watched the other 2 videos, my first video was basically on starting to set up your validation systems and processes, what is a training product, and how you should kind of start to choose your units of competency and things like that, in line with like the Asst validation calculator. Second one covered post-validation, which was validating the actual completed assessments. And my overall recommendation for that is never validate an individual unit just standalone by itself. You can do some validation on it, but it really doesn't give you a whole lot of information about the way that trainer operates. When you start to validate multiple assessments from a class, you're going to get a lot more information in relationship to the quality of the trainer and the quality of the training that is occurring. That's purely my opinion. But having done a lot of validations and run through validations with a lot of different RTOs now and getting really good at getting like good validation systems occurring, group validation is by far a much stronger tool to be using if you actually want to like see the consistency in the assessment decisions that are being made across trainers. So the last one is obviously your pre-validation. I know people use different terms for this, but basically like I use pre and post validation as in like pre-validation is pre the assessment tool being rolled out, or like really just a validation of the assessment tool itself, which is something that you should do literally like at least 10 times when you're creating the assessment tool, when you're reviewing the assessment tool, when you're updating the assessment tool, things like that. And then post validation is like post undertaking assessment, you're validating completed student assessment. So that's the language that I use. It just seems to be really, I mean, for me, that's just really easy to help people understand like what kind of validation it is that we're doing. So when we're doing pre-validation, we're obviously really focused on like, does the design of the assessment tool allow us to do everything that we need to do? And so I guess as somebody who does a lot of design and development of assessment tools, I don't do a huge amount of design in relationship to training materials. But I do a lot of design on assessments. Like I think at the moment I've got contracts for something like 57 assessments that I have to write over the next like 6 months. So I do a lot of assessment design. I do a lot of practical assessment design in particular. I've got a couple of people that I work with that are literally brilliant at writing theory assessments. I'll write theory assessments a little bit, but I find there's probably a lot of designers that are really good at writing theory assessments. The approach that we take for theory assessments is literally just to take the knowledge, the knowledge evidence and structure them based on the knowledge evidence, and then go back through the performance criteria and see where the performance criteria have knowledge aspects and components to it, and then incorporate that as well. But that's fairly straightforward. I have noticed in the last couple of Asst audits, there has been much more of a shift focusing like back to knowledge questions, really making sure that they're contextualized to like the groups. So I don't know how everybody else writes assessment tools. Like I know there's a lot of different ways of doing it. I kind of tend to find that there's like 2 ways to design assessments, and really you're designing them for like a work-based application, or you're designing them for a classroom-based application, and depending on which of those you're designing them for, you have to design particularly the practical assessments in very, very different ways. So but the theory assessments is generally the same for all of them. I do find with international students we might do a little, and job seekers as well, we'll do a little bit more scaffolding. So that's where things like multiple choice assessments as like a formative assessment or activities may come into it to start like building more of that industry terminology into it. But if we're working with work-based trainees and things like that, we don't need to do as much of that because they're getting a lot of that on a day-to-day basis. So theory assessments, that's kind of how we're structuring it. And again, like in the Asst audits and when I'm doing validations, what we're kind of looking for is like, are you giving some very clear guidance on like what is appropriate quality and quantity wise for an answer? This is probably where in my TAC audits and my Asst audits, I've had very different experiences. So in my Asst audits, there, you know, the advices tend to have been, you know, if, you know, if you're asking someone to describe some of the ways that they do this, pick a number and say like 3 ways, like describe 3 ways that you would, you know, do this, or describe 3 pieces of PPE. Whereas in my TAC audits, and most recently I had advice that it was like, well, but what happens if, you know, if they give those 2, is that sufficient? You know, and we've kind of gone, well, like, yes, that is a number of PPE. And so they've gone, oh, well, then you have to accept 2. Or like, and then also by the same way, like, yeah, but what do you really need to have in relationship to PPE? And we've gone, well, you really should have like at a minimum these 4 pieces of PPE. And then they've gone, well, then you've got to have 4. So you can't just pick a random number. Like you've got to have a justification for the number of things that you've chosen. Which can get really challenging, like from a learner perspective, writing the question so that they know like which key pieces of PPE. So like if as a firefighter I said, well, what are your key pieces of PPE? You know, people would go, well, you know, you've got to have your boots, you've got to have your tunic, you've got to have your, you know, you've got to have your hat, you've got to have your gloves. And then other people might go, you know, yeah, and then you've also got to have, you know, your level 1, you know, some people might just go, well, you've got to have your level 1s. Both of those answers are correct. So, you know, there's got to be a little bit of wiggle room for that. With that, we always put onto, like within the guidance for the trainers, we look for statements like, you know, you've got to give this answer or an equivalent answer, and it's up to the trainer to make that final determination. And then in addition to that, you've then obviously got your validation process that's then going to go through and confirm that. And that's why, like, when you are going through your validation processes, you need to have people who are industry current, because what I find is that, like, especially with the more technical qualifications, the language is very different from the unit, like from the unit of competency language. So as I said, like, you know, if in firefighter world, we would kind of go, okay, well, the unit of competency goes, okay, well, what are your 3 key pieces of PPE? And, you know, they might be thinking of things, but in industry terminology, we would just go level 1s or level 2s. But level 1 and level 2 is not it's not the language that you're going to see in the unit of competency. So that's where our marking guide has to be really, really clear on like the kinds of answers. And that's why we want to be having people doing validation who actually have that kind of base understanding and like have that really good industry terminology, so that they're going to turn around and go, yeah, but that's exactly what they meant by that. Like when they said level 1s, they're talking about 5 different pieces of PPE. So we have to accept that as an answer, because that is correct. It's like 100% correct. So, yes. So when we're looking at our, when we're going back to pre-validation, because I realize I've only got a minute now, this is definitely going to have to extend out into a second video. When we're doing our pre-validation on our theory assessments, we just want to have very clear guidelines as to like quality and quantity wise. So I'm going to finish that off here, and then I'm going to have to go into validating practical assessments in another video. And so I apologize for that. But this is just such a key, crucial thing for your guys' businesses. Like effectively, if you don't get validation right, you have very little confidence in relationship to standard 1.8, which is assessment, which is like the number 1 thing you're going to get audited on. Is the number 1 non-compliance that we see in RTOs. So next video, I will be back here and I will see you guys. Hopefully it's not blowing a gale, but it probably will be, for validation of practical assessments. Thanks, guys.